So we have a very special Sunday planned for today. I'm like, yeah, you're probably like, if you didn't read the splash, you're thinking like, yeah, why? There's another guy up here. So we're very excited about today. I'm titling this Sunday, Faith and Science Sunday. And I'm so glad, actually, it worked out that that Youth Connection could be up here, because I really would love our young people especially to pay attention to the topic today. And also, if you have friends and family that you're still hoping that they would come to believe in God's existence, I'm telling you that faith and science is one of those huge topics out there. Tons of individuals are interested in it. Even on the discussion of COVID, that's a constant discussion. And what's the science? How do we interpret this, all this? And so this is a huge and very important topic that I'm so excited. At the very end, we'll have a few questions. Also, if you're watching online, you can put your question as this develops in the YouTube dialogue box, in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get it. Tim is going to mention it out loud, and we'll have the question answered. So many of you know Franklin. This is Franklin Miller. Say hi, Franklin. It's like one of those meetings, if you've ever been to one. Anyway, very excited. Franklin is on this awesome opportunity. Well, we'll get into his opportunities through life, but we get this awesome opportunity to kind of talk to him today. Some of you know him. He's been volunteering on worship team. You may know his wife. She preaches here from time to time, as well as helps out on worship team when it's needed. And we're so grateful that we get a chance to get to know them and interact with them. I mean, truly, we are excited about that alone. But there's a whole other side of Franklin that most of you might not know, and it includes, I'll just give one hint, it includes working at NASA, the literal NASA. There's not some other acronym I'm going to bring out. Okay, so he has this incredible, rich scientific background, and he's also a dear brother in the Lord. And we are grateful to see those two realms mix. We're going to interview him on some questions of faith and science. So we want you to put your heart out there, your mind out there, be open to some of this, because we're going to get into some great and very important topics, but also every now and again, in social ways, there's topics that Christians put on in that sacred box that you're really not allowed to talk about. And some of the things in that sacred box include things that interact with science. And I have often felt like I'm the guy that either has to take the brunt of it or get the privilege, whichever you decide, of bringing those topics out and saying that we need to talk about these things and we can't just punt to faith as if this isn't before us. So I'm so excited about it. I want to give you one practical application, and then I'm pretty much just going to interact with Franklin here, okay? In my last church, I was teaching a catechism class. And we had catechism for at least 3 years there. And a couple of students had gotten into their high school science classes, and they asked for a private meeting with the pastor together. Like they'd been chomping through the bit on some questions. And they came into the church, and we had chatted for a little while, and they said, look, we're really struggling. We love God, but the way we were raised on some of these subjects in reference to the universe and the world are totally different than what we had learned over here in our science classes. But interestingly enough, we don't feel like the science is that hostile, but we're struggling with how we maybe have to conceptualize this now. And so we walk through models that Christians have used for 2,000 years, by the way. This is one of those discussions that Christians have literally been discussing for 2,000 years. And there's not been one unanimous, point of consent on some of these topics. So giving them some options, they left the church saying, we love God and we love science. And they were talking about going into medical careers at the time. And I was like, yes, we need more Christians there. So again, excited about this subject, but it's very practical too. It's very practical. It's not like unimportant. This is pastoral. This is Christian. You're going to go home, and I hope you get to have these conversations at the dinner table even more than you already had. Okay, enough of that. Let's walk into some questions for Franklin today. I want us to be curious learners. Franklin, I know you're a follower of Jesus Christ, but not everyone knows how you use, I mentioned lightly already the NASA bit, but not everyone knows how you use your gifts and talents for the Lord or just what God has given you. Could you give us a little bit of a background on where you're at today and how you got there?
Yeah, so I'm currently a professor in mechanical engineering at the University of Wisconsin, and I kind of do research in the area that's really kind of applied physics, and that's useful for NASA, and we'll get into why it's useful for NASA. It's also useful for cooling quantum computers too, lots of different applications. But if you knew me, I'll just give you a little bit of history. If you knew me as a child and say early teenager, you would probably never have guessed that I would end up where I am now, because really the church and church music was just kind of my life. I took 6 years of piano and jazz organ lessons. I started singing in church when I was 3, quite literally 3 years old. And my grandfather was a pastor, and so everybody who knew me thought I was going to end up being a worship director or a pastor like my grandfather. And so, interestingly, when I got to middle school, grade school was not that interesting for me for some reason. My mother made me do my homework, and I got through it. But in middle school, I discovered mathematics and science, and it really I was very interested in it, and I found out I had a real talent for it. And so I just kind of took off then. I actually finished high school a year early because of that. And I was at this point where I had to decide what I was going to do, and I really was debating right up until the very end whether I was going to go and be a music voice major or whether I was going to go into some kind of scientific field. And what I decided on is, kind of for practical reasons, I decided to study engineering. And so I'm from Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, kind of in the country. I think I grew up about 5 miles outside of a town of 17,000 people. So, something twice the size of Stoughton or smaller than that. And I was out in the country, about 6 miles away from that. So we're talking really in the country. And so I decided to go to West Virginia University and study engineering. My father's from West Virginia. I had a great uncle who studied engineering there and worked for Boeing. And so I went off to study there. I got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and decided to go work for 4 years because I had some student loans to pay off, quite frankly. I knew I wanted to do a PhD eventually, and so I went and worked at a practical engineering job designing equipment and worked my way up, and I was kind of the head of the engineering department at a small company. But I knew I wanted to go back for a PhD, so I made applications to schools, and I ended up at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I really started looking for a project, a PhD project that was more physics than engineering, although I was still in the engineering college, and I found this professor who was doing research into ultra-cold cooling using quantum fluids.
What?
Using quantum fluids. So these are, if you take the helium that's in a standard balloon, like a helium balloon, and you cool that down to 2 degrees, 2.17 degrees above absolute zero. So absolute zero is as cold as you could theoretically get.
Even colder than Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's even colder than Wisconsin. In fact, it's quite a bit colder. Anyway, so if you cool this fluid down, it has no friction, it behaves in very strange ways, and there's all these interesting things you can do with it. So I was really in graduate school focused on, basically inventing new ways to do that, to cool using this, and understanding the quantum mechanical behavior of these fluids. That's what I really focused on. Interesting to note, I was not a NASA nerd. I was not the kind of person who was, I knew about NASA and was somewhat interested in what they did, but it wasn't something where, I know people who are just totally into NASA. I have graduate students who come work for me because their goal is to work for NASA. So they come get a PhD with me so they can go work at NASA. But that wasn't me. But when I got done, I knew I wanted to be a professor, but there weren't really any positions open at the time. Nobody was hiring. And I found out that these NASA organizations were really interested in low temperatures. Jet Propulsion Laboratory offered me a job in the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. My family lived in Virginia. I wanted to be near them, so that made the decision for me. And I went to work at NASA and ended up working on the James Webb Space Telescope, and also doing some research on my own ideas and working on things like pre-planning for a Venus lander mission, all kinds of crazy, interesting stuff. But the focus of the work was really on cooling things down to ultra-cold temperatures. That's, the reason I went there. An aside, and I forgot this last time, I need to bring this in. When I was in Boston area, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I found this church, the Park Street Church. It's kind of a famous church. It sits right on the Boston Common, and it's an evangelical Christian church there. And it was just a really interesting place to be because Boston didn't have a lot of evangelical churches, especially at that time. And so there were people from a wide variety of backgrounds. There were people from the South who were Southern Baptist. There were people from the Midwest who were maybe Lutheran or CMA or different. And so it's just interesting. It was this mix of Christians who were all believers, but maybe didn't have exactly the same viewpoints on the non-essentials. And so I was in this Bible study with these people, and they were coming from very different backgrounds, from the South, from one guy from Chicago area, and some from California, different places. And so it was really interesting because it was a great place to agree on the essentials and then have this really wonderful, vibrant discussion of things and get different people's viewpoints on things like, theological matters or, science, actually. It was really, really quite. So this was a time for great intellectual growth and also great spiritual growth at the same time. It really was an amazing time there. And so I ended up, working at NASA kind of not because I planned to go there originally, and I ended up in this position where, I worked with NASA. And I often have people ask me, why in the world did you quit working at NASA? Well, it's because I wanted to mentor students and teach. And so I started looking for a position, and then I was kind of discouraged because there were some hiring freezes at one university where I was supposed to get a job offer, and it didn't work out. And then one day I was sitting at my desk at NASA shortly after that, and I got a call from the University of Wisconsin from a guy who's now my colleague. And he said, we're looking for somebody in low temperature cryogenics, and would you be interested in applying? And I said yes. And I remember hanging up the phone and knowing I'm going to Wisconsin. I interviewed and got the job, but it was just one of these things where I was very discouraged because I hadn't found that academic position, and because I really wanted to teach, and just knew when I put the phone down that this is where you're going. And that's where I ended up 11 years ago. And so, I still do research for NASA. I have funding from NASA, and 9 of my former graduate students now work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena and at Goddard Space Flight Center, among other places, but 9 of them are working for NASA. And so I still have interaction I still develop cooling techniques for NASA astrophysics missions.
I think it's kind of fitting that someone who deals with cold temperatures has to live up in the north. I think it...
I am from Virginia. It's certainly not this cold there, but...
So this gets us a little bit further. You mentioned NASA. So cool. It's just exciting even hearing the word as a possibility. That's certainly not on my horizon. I really want to ask you this question about why something like that matters to our discussion on science and faith. What exactly were you doing there that might weigh in to processing some of the big questions that we Christians have to wrestle through?
Well, so my expertise is in ultra-low temperatures. I mean, temperatures as cold as, some of the systems I'm working on developing will go within 5,000ths of a degree of absolute zero. So if you put 0.005, that's the temperature above absolute zero. I don't know if you know what absolute zero is, but that's as cold as you could theoretically get. You can't get to absolute zero, but we're talking about cooling things down that cold. That would be for quantum computers or for these detectors. And so in the youth group that I work with, some of my son's friends have asked me, what did you do at NASA? And I said, well, one of the things I did is I worked on developing technology for time machines. And I'm telling you what, that gets their attention, right? Because they're thinking like Back to the Future or something like that. So
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going with.
So time machines. And so it gets their attention.
Yeah. So I want to hit on this subject of time machines a little bit. I think that is exciting. I know enough about the movies to know a little bit about time travel. That's about what I got to offer today. But I want to hit on this a little bit further. You're working in NASA. You're working on these supposed time machines. Tell us what that has meant for discoveries about the age of the universe and how we're supposed to understand how we could even measure that or think about that.
Yeah. So it's not really time machines like time travel. It's building a machine that can look back in time and see what things looked like 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, even beyond that. And so there's a couple of concepts that I'm going to talk through here that will give us an understanding of how you could possibly do that. And so the first one is the idea of redshift. And so if you've ever been standing along the road and you hear a car go by and the horn's blowing, as the car is coming toward you, the pitch goes up. You hear this whoo, and then as the car is heading away from you, goes past you, the pitch of the sound goes down. And so the frequency of that sound, that pitch, goes up as it's approaching you, and as it's going away, it gets shifted downward. And so the same thing happens with light. If things are traveling away from you at a high rate of speed, the light gets stretched out. Basically, it goes to a longer wavelength or lower frequency, which means it becomes more red. So if you have light that's white, if you have light that's in the middle of the spectrum, blue's the higher frequency light and red's the longer, wavelength, lower frequency light. And so when we say red shifted, we mean that the frequency gets shifted. And so what it means is that if I look at the light coming from an object and it's, I can see basically how fast it's moving away from me by whether it's red or blue, or if it's red shifted. And actually, astrophysicists use this if they want to know the rotational rate of a black hole. They'll look at stars on the side of the black hole. If it's rotating this way, the side going away, and they'll look at the side coming toward them, and they'll see the red shift in the light from the star going that way on its way around, and the blue shift in the light this way, and they can get an idea of the speed difference between the two, and they can get the rotational rate of that black hole. That's how they figure out how black holes, how fast they're rotating. And so the first thing is there's red shift associated with lights, how fast it's going away from you. The second thing, and the other thing is our universe is expanding. We're in a universe that's expanding in time. And so the other thing, the crucial concept, is to understand this concept of expansion. So I like to use a balloon example, and so I didn't bring my pen up with me.
Anyone has any balloons in their purses?
Okay. So if you imagine I had a balloon here, and I should have had a balloon, and I put 3 dots on the top of the balloon, right there in a line, and let's say the first one's A, and then B and C, and they're all an inch from one another. So, dot B is an inch from dot A, and dot C is an inch from dot B, and the distance between A and C is 2 inches. And the balloon is half blown up. So then I decide, I'm going to blow the balloon up more, and let's say at the end of me blowing it up, say it took a second, those dots are now further apart, and the distance between A and B is now 2 inches, because I blew the balloon up to twice the size, and the distance between A and C is now 4 inches. And what you can see is in that time, B moved away from A at a rate of 1 inch a second, and C moved away from A at a rate of 2 inches a second. So the further something is from you in a uniform expansion, the faster its velocity or its speed is going away from you. So this brings up something. So what it means is things that are further from me right now, the light coming from them will be more heavily redshifted. So I can tell how far things are away from me by how much redshift there is. And so I can say, oh, that should be visible light, but instead of being visible light at this frequency, it's now redder, or it's not even visible at all. I need a night vision camera to see. It's now in the infrared. It's like the heat coming off of us that we see with a night vision camera. And so I can see how far things are away. Now, there's another thing that comes into this, and that is that light doesn't instantaneously leave where it came from and get to me. And we know this, that there's a time it takes for the light leaving the sun to reach us. It's minutes. But for stars that are a light year away, that light took a year to get to me. If it's 1,000 light years away, it took 1,000 years to get to me. And so things that are further away will be redshifted, but also they take longer to get to me. So if I look at things that are redshifted, I'm really seeing what happened there 1,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. So if I see some explosion of something that's heavily redshifted, that explosion's long over. I'm seeing the light coming to me. It would be like if somebody made a sound a couple miles away, the explosion's over, and then when the sound gets to you later, several seconds later, that event is already done with. And so what we see is if we decide that we're going to put some camera up in space, basically, so we don't have to look through the atmosphere, we can see a clear picture. We put that camera up there, and we can decide we're going to, instead of looking at visible light, which we would look at something very close to us, we can decide we're going to look over in redshift more and get to longer wavelengths, and we'll be seeing things that are further away, but also events that happen back in time. And we can look very far back in time this way. And one of the missions that was done this way was looked at the cosmic background radiation, which is what's kind of left over from, well, that's our next topic, isn't it? Yeah, is left over from the Big Bang. And so if you look far enough back in time, at a low enough temperature, meaning you're looking at really redshifted stuff, what you see all around us is radiation or light that's left over from the beginning of time, really. It's the beginning of time.
And that kind of is where I wanted to go, because in our Q&As over the years, I always get this question, what about the Big Bang? And so I heard a couple of things here. First, I heard him talk about the expansion of the universe, right? This universe is currently expanding. Kind of the way I've looked at it is if you just click the rewind button, everything, or you let the air out of the balloon, everything's kind of coming back together. So imagine all of the stuff of the universe coming back together. It gets us to this point that they're calling Big Bang.
Right.
I want you to just demystify this just a little, if you can, in simple terms. For some of us, we all need a little help here. And going into that just a little bit, what is the Big Bang? That when we talk about that, what is it? And
So,
how can you help us to think about it?
So, you know, we haven't seen back to the Big Bang. We've seen this evidence of the Big Bang, and the head of that project that came out of the Goddard Space Flight Center where I worked, it had happened before I got there, that mission did. But the guy won the Nobel Prize in 2006 when I was there, so I had some interaction with the people on that team, became good friends with one of the people on that team. And, you know, basically, when this guy put the graph of his results up at a conference, there was a standing ovation. They didn't have to say anything. Because this was like, it was evidence that there was this explosion, because there was all this heat left over from it that had spread out in time. So what does it mean? Theoretical physicists think that's the beginning of space-time, meaning the beginning of the physical universe that we have, the beginning of this around us, everything we see,
here.
everything. And, you know, to think about that, you know, as a Christian, I think the very idea of a universe that had a beginning is consistent with the idea of there being a creator. You know, that there's this God that exists, not physical God. He says he's spirit, he's not physical. But he created this universe that we live in. It's a physical creation of God. And so there used to be a theory before all this Big Bang stuff that the universe was eternal. And there were atheists who said, you know, that it always did exist, you don't need a creator because there isn't a beginning. And then we come up with this idea that there seems to be evidence that there is a beginning, and you can even hear atheists today saying, well, we don't need a God because we can explain what happened after the Big Bang, you know, in steps. But I think for myself, the fact that there is a beginning is just confirmation that in the beginning God created. And I think that's consistent with what we're seeing.
So if we found that the universe was eternal, that would be, in theory, that's why it's been a kind of a challenge prior to finding that the universe had a beginning, because kind of at least later Christian theology made it very clear that God did this out of nothing, right? And so then later on you have these confirmations from 1929 onward, one after another after another after another, that give this conclusion that the universe has a beginning. That's really great news for how we've conceptualized God's doing things in our theology. So I think that's something that we should almost get excited about. But every now and again as Christians can get nervous about that word. And so I just want to press this just a little bit further. For me, and how I've looked at what Genesis is really trying to say, literally within the first 2 chapters of Genesis, there are 4 definitions of the word day in Hebrew. Literally, it's used in 4 different contexts in the very first 2 chapters. But usually we don't know that, and so then we get thinking like this is an exact description about how God did it. But as soon as you realize that there's a lot of loose categories there for us to think about these topics, it alleviates the pressure about, well, is that exactly what we thought it said or not? And it alleviates the timeline issue. So that's Isaac's mind. So when I hear stuff about the Big Bang, I'm like, wow, this is so cool. I'm open to this. But it can make some Christians a little bit nervous. As a Christian, have you ever thought the sciences posed obstacles to your being a Christian? Why or why not? Or perhaps benefits as well?
So, you know, I come at this from a little bit different perspective than some people who are in science and maybe come to faith later. I became a believer as a child, and I was a believer long before I was a scientist, before I started looking into these things. And so maybe that's a little different. But, you know, I don't see science as being an obstacle. I think there's a lot of, I think if we think we've got everything figured out, if we really think that we understand exactly how all the steps happened, how the universe got here, and we have some idea that God did it exactly this way, then we could run into trouble. But I see the revelation of how the universe has gotten to the point that it is as something that God didn't tell us about. He didn't tell us everything he's been up to. We get basically a description, I think, in the Bible, in Genesis, of God created. That's true.
He did it.
He did it, but not the specifics of how that process came about, how things changed in time. And I think the reason for that, one reason is, even today, if God wrote down through someone, revealed to us exactly how things work, we wouldn't understand it, because we don't really still understand all that much. We know a lot more than we did, but our understanding, there are these couple of open questions in the astrophysics world about dark energy and dark matter that we don't have a good explanation for, and we're grappling with, because I think it's far more complex than we can comprehend. And if you think back a few thousand years to what people knew at that point, writing down even what we know, like the Schrodinger's equations or Einstein's general relativity equations, and this is how it works. It would have been just gibberish. It's gibberish to most of us now, right? We go get, I went and studied for years to kind of comprehend some of those concepts. You have to get advanced degrees. So, and that is not even really the full picture. And so I think if you come at it from the understanding that you're not going to understand everything, you don't have it all nailed down, that God didn't give you all the details. I like to think of it like you take your 3-year-old child to the beach, and there's this big ocean out there. And what they see at the beach, at the shore, is they see some seashells washed up on the shore. They see the waves coming in, but they have no comprehension of what's really the totality of what's there, what's underneath the ocean, the sharks, all the animals under the seafloor, the things that look like aliens down on the bottom where, we wouldn't know unless we had deep diving submarines. We wouldn't even see them. And so, but the child goes out there, we let them explore the beginning. They see a seashell wash up, they look at that, they see a starfish, they see different things. And they're exploring, and they're seeing what washes up on the shore. And I think to some extent, that's kind of where we are as human beings. We set this telescope out there really not very far out. We're it's impressive. We put this thing in orbit, but, the James Webb Space Telescope will be 1 million miles from Earth. In terms of how far the stars are away that we're looking at it, that's nothing, right? We're spending $10 billion, and thousands of people have been working on this to accomplish that. And it is an amazing accomplishment, but what we're going to do is we're going to look at what's coming in, right? We're going to look at these waves coming in, these light waves coming in, and we're going to deduce or try to figure out what's going on out there. And we're going to learn stuff. But I think if we look at it from that perspective, I think then it leaves us open to say, we're going to, we, as Christians, we seek truth, right? We seek truth about the physical world. We seek truth about who God is. And I think that, I'm not afraid to look at what's going on in the physical world. I think every time I look at the physical world and see complexity, whether it's, subatomic particles, or how beautifully DNA is a simple language, but it conveys all this complex information, or look at a leaf on a tree, or even look at the solar system or the universe. All these different scales, you can look at it, and when I see the complexity of the universe, and it's beautiful to me. It kind of adjusts my perspective of who I am relative to God, is what I would say. Because, I see, God as being, sometimes we can think we've accomplished something and we become a little arrogant and we think, but I think looking around us at the world can really just kind of bring us back to reality and help us to realize God is God. He's infinite. And the physical world that he's created for us to live in is just far more complex than even we can look at. We have experts in biology that delve into that area, and we have experts in, astrophysics in that area, and they spend their whole lives understanding one thing, and you just think about, this is all part of God's creation, every piece of it, and it brings about humility, I think, and reverence for who God is.
I want to get to one more question, then we're going to open it up, okay? So if there are any on YouTube, this is a great time to throw some chats out there. A quick thought and then a question, which my thought might provoke more questions. So I'll throw this thought out there. What he had said about the time machines is that if you actually go on like NASA's website, you can see how deep they've been looking. And he was talking about how long some of this light will take, even at the speed of light, to get from where it is all the way to us. The distance of that and how far and deep we can see is in the multi-billions of years. It's incredible to think about whatever's happening there now today is totally distinct from what we're seeing now. That's the time machine concept. And I put that out there to provoke more questions, okay? But the last question is we have some young people here who may be interested, or maybe families who have young people or grandchildren as well, who may be interested in these questions and what this matters for them. In fact, as I was talking, we were hanging out with a family. I was talking with a young person in this church, and they were asking me questions where I really could do the philosophy really great, and I was having a blast in that area, and I knew the general outline of this. Then he started asking me questions like, this is like a 13-year-old asking me questions about the science of something, this or that, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is incredible. So, with that in mind, we have young Christians who might be thinking about careers in science, in the sciences, or just trying to process these issues, or perhaps parents trying to help their children think through these issues. Any advice for them?
Yeah, so the one thing I would say is beware of this kind of artificial conflict between science and Christianity. Because, I mean, there's some people that say, well, you can't be an honest scientist and a Christian at the same time. And what I would say to this is we should be truth seekers as Christians. And honest investigation of the physical world, an honest look at how the physical world works is consistent with Christianity. And I think God expects us to turn our minds off and say, well, I'm not going to look at the physical world around me. I think we look for truth, and we look for an understanding of what's going on around us, and I think that's a good thing. Science is an investigation of the physical world that is created by a non-physical God. God says he's spirit. So this idea that I'm going to delve into science and disprove the existence of God is you can't. It's not going to happen because, I don't think God's sitting there worried about, these human beings are looking at science and they're figuring out how the universe that I created works or how things happened, and therefore they're not going to believe in me anymore. We don't have the tools to prove or to disprove God. There's no way. We cannot look at the physical reality of the world and disprove that there's a God. Scientific investigation tells us the process by which things happen. It can tell you this happened and then happened. It doesn't tell you the motivation. It doesn't tell you why there's a universe. Why are we here? Why is there a universe? An investigation of God, looking into God and what he's revealed to us, tells us why we're here. Because the process, it's scientific investigation doesn't tell me why. It tells me how this process happened and that process happened and steps by which things happen. It can help me understand how the world works and harness that to man's benefit. You can understand science and then utilize some of those principles to create, computers and televisions and healthcare and cure diseases and things like that. But it doesn't tell me the motivation for why I'm here. And my faith tells me that.
Amen. So, are there any questions? All right, Phil, number one. And I'll repeat what you say for everyone that's watching at home or later on.
So, you say a big bang, which would mean an explosion, I would think. And explosions are generally very disorderly. Yet when you look at the universe, and science tells us that the universe and the world that God created are all very orderly. So do you have any thoughts on how something so very orderly could come out of something so very disorderly as an explosion?
Before he answers it, the question is he, for everyone at home or whoever may not have heard it, is this idea of an explosion, like a big bang or something like that, this incredible increase in energy, would in theory bring about a lot of chaos. But Phil's point is that there's a lot of order. So how do we go about navigating that question? Is that about right, Phil?
Yeah, maybe it's because there's naming problem here. And I think you addressed this in the first service about this Big Bang,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and I didn't know that particular history, but
So I had read something a while back that there was this atheist named Frederick Hoyle who attached the word Big Bang to this singularity that took place, which brought about an incredible amount of energy. There could have been another word attached to it, okay? And he didn't like the idea because there could have been some implications as to, well, if the universe had a beginning and isn't eternal, then it needs somebody or something to get it started. And so he literally gets on the radio. This is Frederick Hoyle, scientist. And if my understanding of the story is right, he literally gets on the radio and starts making fun of it to try to discredit the idea. Like, how in the world could we get a Big Bang? That makes no sense. So we get the word from an atheist, interestingly enough, and it kind of stuck as they began to think about it. And so just kind of keep that in your background of your mind as you think about how are we supposed to process this idea. But I don't know if you have anything more to add besides that.
yeah, so, I don't know if I have the best answer to this, but what I would say is that there had to be some beginning. There's a beginning to everything. And I would say that the order comes from the laws of the universe, how things work. There are all these interesting constants and forces. You have the forces, electromagnetic force and nuclear forces, and it's the interaction of those, I think, the way the system, there's a design, in my opinion, behind how the universe works. Why, when I decide I'm going to throw a baseball this way and it ends up going across the plate, the next time I exert the same forces on the baseball, it happens exactly the same way, or nearly the same way, except for the wind comes by or something. And so this idea that there's predictability to the universe, that there's a set of rules about how it behaves, actually really probably came from the idea that there's a God, so we can expect that things are not completely unpredictable. If you think about, if you look at the Greek system and the Greek God system, there were these fickle gods and they kind of did whatever, they changed the rules whenever they wanted, they did things the way they wanted. But this idea of a Christian God or a Judeo-Christian God where things are absolute. And I think that thinking actually came over into early science, and this idea that things are predictable, that there are underlying ways that things work and they work the same way all the time. And I think that is the key for me as a scientist, is that it's the underlying rules of how things work that make the order. And so one of the things that the James Webb Space Telescope is going to look at, so we've looked back at the radiation far enough back to see the radiation of the Big Bang. We've looked at stars, and we've looked back millions of years at stars. But one of the things we want to do is look back at that time after 100 million years after the Big Bang, when things would have started to form together, and see what the processes were. Why did if you had something that was uniform, the second law of thermodynamics says it would never become non-uniform. That's a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. What caused the gravity to make these things, we won't know what caused, but where were the seeds that started this idea that you get black holes and galaxies forming around those, and you get these large gravitational things? Because what we have in the universe right now is a state of somewhat, it's order in some ways and it's disorder in others, because there's clumps of mass and energy, and it's not completely uniform. When everything is run down to entropy death, everything would be completely uniform, and we don't have that. So scientists are really looking to answer some of those questions, or at least observe what happened far enough back when this order started to come out of the the completely uniform. It's not completely uniform, but it's nearly uniform background that was there.
So what I hear is that there could be an incredible expansion of energy, but because there's these constants in place, almost these like prior rules, it can begin to bring forth a certain kind of order at some level.
Yeah, and some of these parameters, if they were significantly different, the universe wouldn't work the way it does.
And Tim, is there any on YouTube today?
There's a comment.
Is it a safe comment?
Yes.
Go for it. I mean, is it on the topic, is what I mean by that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for your perspective, Franklin. For me, science is a way to understand God's creation. I love learning about how God created the massive universe and intricately created life with tiny atoms.
So this is just a word of thanks from someone on YouTube. Are there any questions elsewise? Because these are good. Ann?
I think kind of building on that, because I'm the biological sciences person, and I always think Newton's third law, entropy, is the natural order of things is disorder, and there's laws that keep things predictable, but life would never happen from physical things. And people like to say, oh, we're made of all the same chemicals in the earth, and that's true, but things in our body and that create life and make life work don't follow the rules of the physical world. Osmosis doesn't happen. All you have enzymes to put potassium where it needs to be, and other kind of catalysts to make pressures the way they should be in the body. So if you just had physical laws, you would never have life either. It takes an order, a direction to create human life or even plant life.
So I wish I could repeat that exactly as she said it. She makes a broad point that I'm just going to let, if Franklin wants to comment on or not.
Yeah, I'm not a biologist. and my last biology class was in high school, just so I know. I studied a lot of physics.
So I think we're just going to receive the comment.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that good? Thank you, Ann. I should have just given you a microphone, but we're not sharing and stuff. Darlene.
Yeah, well,
Are you able to teach about creation at the university was the question.
yeah. So, the classes I teach are, a lot of them for the undergrads are practical engineering courses. So it's, and then at the graduate level, I teach quantum mechanics, things like that to students. The topic doesn't really come up in the context of that kind of a practical applied work. But I do have wonderful conversations with students and with graduate students. Many of my graduate students, I have conversations about this very topic, about, Christianity and science. And it's been a good opportunity to interact with students. And I take advantage of that. At the beginning of my classes, when I introduce myself, I usually have a picture of myself participating in a Christmas play, and I talk about, the fact that my wife works at InterVarsity. And what I will then do is have students fill out a card for office hours, and then on the back I say, tell me something about yourself. And, I get all kinds of interesting comments from the students at the beginning of the semester about what their background is, and I learn that many of them are believers also. Just through that, they'll just let me know. And so, yeah, I don't know, I'm not teaching the kind of class where, that necessarily, we're not talking about the creation of the universe. We're talking about low temperatures or engineering or physics like quantum mechanics and statistical physics, which have applications in this field, but, I'm not teaching that.
So we have time for one more question today, and then we'll prepare to close the service. Any other questions that would like to be asked today? I know that we just had a podcast, Recapitulate, where we talked about the meaning of Genesis, and I know my wife and I are going to go back on. We had a couple more questions and do it again and go a little bit further. So if there's interest kind of on the theological side, I know there's going to be more materials coming. But Rob, you have a question, it looks like.
So I'm wondering if the theory of intelligent design, is that a valid theory from a scientific standpoint?
So Rob's question is, the theory of intelligent design, is it a valid theory from a scientific standpoint?
And
Do you want to go there, or do you want me to jump on a little? Do you know?
I am not what I would really need to, I'm not a biologist, and I think that really has more to do with biology than it does with the kind of stuff I've studied. And I know I'm going to say something.
You're good, go for it.
No, I'm not going to, what I'm trying to say is that really has to do with the creation of biological life, I think, is what that's related to. And like I said, my last biology course was in high school, so I don't know that I'm expert enough. But you may have some insights on that from a philosophical point of view.
Quick thought on the philosophical end. The theory of intelligent design, if all you're using it is this idea that there must be an intelligent designer in a broad framework, then of course, then it's very conducive to like Christian theology. And the intelligent design movement got started and questioned Darwin's theory in reference to certain mechanisms in the eye or the bacterial flagellum and how it kind of comes together. And over the years, I've noticed that those sorts of arguments have started to fall as well. And the reason why I'm a little cautious of the movement is because of the movement. Even though in the broad scheme we want to use this language of intelligent design, it seems to make a lot of sense. So I'm cool with that. But as the movement is concerned, is if you put God in the gap between this part of science and this part of science and say God must have done that to get this part over there, you have done two things. Number one, you've created an opportunity to disprove God at some point. Because as soon as they fill that gap, God's no longer needed there either. And then the second thing that you do is you actually make God something that he's not. You actually make God as the guy who comes on in once in a while and bumps things forward. And so that's something that I'm cautious with on a theological level. Like, we want God as the creator of it all and the sustainer of it all. And he even gifts. Notice in like Genesis, it says that he's, in days like 4 and 5, it says that he said, let the land bring forth the living plants and creatures. It says, let the land. It doesn't actually say, poof, God. And so because of that, I'm very open to these creational, I'm very open to where the science may lead on that. And also it says in day 5, let the water bring forth, teem with life. So I just think we need to be open to whatever that is. I'm not saying that I have all that figured out, but I'm a little questioning of just putting God in a gap. But as a broad stroke, there seems to make some sense that you didn't have this creation pop into existence uncaused out of nothing, which is I think what we hear when we get to this discussion on the Big Bang. Like, that makes no sense. If everything else has a beginning, or everything that has a beginning needs a cause, the universe needs a cause. God is that cause. If that's all you mean by intelligent design, then yes. But the movement as a whole, I think, there's been more and more holes being poked into it as I've read it, even though I think it was done out of like the desire to do something really good. So you know, that's Isaac's take on that. And I know we should like talk forever on this topic. So I know Franklin's going to hang out afterward a little while. I didn't guarantee him to anything, no, but I know I asked a couple students to come and ask questions because this would be an awesome opportunity. So if you have questions for Franklin, I can talk on the theological end. He's going to talk on that end, though, so please go there. And then maybe one day we'll get to a part 2. I hope everyone had a good time opening this box up. I think it's about time the church world stop avoiding opening some of these boxes because they feel too sacred. We need to be leading in these discussions, and I hope that you have a lot more food for thought and feeling like there's room here to discuss with non-believers these sorts of questions. After service today, we have Phil and Lynn over here ready to pray for you, and so don't forget about that. Can we all stand and receive God's final blessing if you're at home as well? Tim, were there any more questions? We can't answer them right now, but okay, maybe we can get to them later. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this church, their willingness to open up these boxes and to discuss these things. We thank you for Franklin today, and we pray that we would be enthused to use our gifts and talents in whatever realm we find ourselves in. But also, God, give us courage to start interacting on these topics, how we can mesh truth everywhere that we find it, bring it all together. We thank you for your truth. We bless this congregation in Jesus' name. Amen. Have a good Sunday, everyone. Church is on for next Sunday, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Don't forget about prayer. And if I chatted with you about connecting with Franklin, please make sure you do.